Hey, this is Robert Naini, your spray foam advisor. This week I want to talk about one of the more difficult topics to understand and really wrap your head around and understand the details and the specifics behind, and that's when you can use an ignition barrier for spray foam insulation or for foam plastic materials in accordance with the building code. So interestingly enough, this topic comes up all the time. You get questions from homeowners, you get questions from builders, architects, contractors, and SPF applicators on a regular basis in the industry that just don't understand the nuances or miss really the fundamentals of the building code and what the building code says about the ignition barrier requirement. So the very simple language that the building code uses is it says when access to the attic or crawl space, this is for both the IRC and the IBC, when access to the attic or crawl space is limited to the service of utilities. And that's the key phrase. When access is limited to the service of utilities, then an ignition barrier is acceptable. Basically, that it's saying that if the only reason to go into that space, if the only reason to enter that space is servicing the utilities, it's working on the HVAC system, it's working on a light bulb, working on a wire that might be running up there, an internet cable, a power line. If the only purpose for going into the attic or crawl space is service of utilities, then an ignition barrier is an acceptable form of protection for foam plastic insulation. And the code actually says that under those circumstances, that the foam plastic insulation has to be fully covered, has to be covered in such a way that it's not exposed to the attic by the ignition barrier material. The code then goes on to provide exceptions and directs us to the special approval section of the code, which allows us to do things like the Appendix X test, which is how we get many of our products in today's commercial use are able to be used in attics that are limited to the service of utilities without any additional fire protection because they pass a large-scale special approval that omits the ignition barrier. But the key to determine that an ignition barrier is all that is required and that that test is sufficient, that the Appendix X test can be applied in that situation, the key is when access is limited to the service of utilities. As soon as access goes beyond service of utilities, then a thermal barrier is required. What happens is that section of the code no longer applies. You don't get to use the attic or crawl space exception to the code. And now a thermal barrier is required. And so then you would have to use a full half-inch gypsum board as the prescribed thermal barrier or a material that allows you to omit the thermal barrier requirements, such as an intumescent coating that passes interior finish standards. But this week I want to focus on ignition barriers, and the key here is when access to the attic or crawl space is limited to the service of utilities, then only an ignition barrier is required. And that allows us to use most closed cell foams without any additional fire protection because they meet the Appendix X test. Many of our open cell foams today meet the same requirement. They pass the Appendix X test and can also be left exposed. Or you're looking at covering the material with an ignition barrier or a product that omits the ignition barrier requirement, such as intumescent coatings. There are many intumescent coatings on the market that can be applied over open cell foams, the remaining open cell foams that need them to omit the ignition barrier requirement in that case. So the key phraseology is attics or crawl spaces that are limited to the service of utilities. Once you store something in that space, once you convert that space to storage, that is beyond the service of utilities, and that means a thermal barrier is required. So focus on that guidance, that access is limited to the service of utilities, and you'll better understand when ignition barriers apply to attics and crawl spaces. This has been Robert Naini with Spray Foam Advisor. Thanks for checking us out. Catch us on some more videos. I love questions. Anyone out there, feel free to shoot in a question. I'll give you an email address right here for any questions you have. Send them to questions@sprayfoamadvisor.com.
sprayfoamadvisorsingular.com. So questions at sprayfoamadvisor.com. Go ahead and send those questions in. I'll get to as many of them as I can, and I'll try to incorporate a select few into some of my weekly videos. And of course, if you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to the blog if you haven't already done that. Find us on YouTube and like us, like and follow us there. And check us out on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Find us on all of your favorite social media sites, and you can keep up with the words of wisdom coming out of Spray Foam Advisor. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. We'll catch you on some more videos. Take care.